In the shadowed corridors of Pemberton Palace, where whispers carry more weight than gold and secrets are currency, one woman's loyalty would be tested beyond measure. Lady Margaret Whitmore had served the royal household for 30 years, watching empires rise and fall within these ancient walls. But nothing could have prepared her for the January morning when she would witness a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. As she stood hidden behind the ornate tapestry, watching Queen Consort Helena react to devastating headlines about the beloved Crown Princess Catherine, Margaret realized she was about to become keeper of the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. The morning mist clung to the windows of Pemberton Palace like ghostly fingers, refusing to yield to the pale winter sun. Lady Margaret Whitmore adjusted her crisp uniform and checked her pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. 30 years of royal service had taught her that punctuality was not merely expected but essential, especially on mornings when the household buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Margaret had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to prepare for what promised to be a challenging day. The newspapers had arrived at 4:30, delivered by the same boy who had been cycling up the palace drive for the past decade. She had sorted them carefully, as protocol demanded, separating the serious publications from the tabloids, the international papers from the domestic ones. It was a ritual she had performed thousands of times, yet today felt different. The headline that caught her attention first was emblazoned across the front page of the Royal Observer in bold, unforgiving letters. The words seemed to leap from the page, each letter carefully crafted to inflict maximum impact. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read the devastating claims about Crown Princess Catherine, allegations that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond. Princess Catherine had always been the people's darling, the commoner who had captured the heart of Prince Alexander, and, by extension, the entire nation. Her grace under pressure, her charitable work, and her genuine warmth had made her arguably the most beloved member of the royal family. The accusations, now spread across multiple front pages, seemed designed to destroy everything she had built over the past 15 years. Margaret remembered Catherine's wedding day, the joy that had radiated from every corner of the palace. She had been assigned to assist with the bride's preparations and had witnessed firsthand the nervous excitement, the genuine love between the young couple, and the hope that this union represented for a modernizing monarchy. Catherine had been kind to the staff, remembering names and asking about families, a stark contrast to some of the more traditional royals who barely acknowledged their existence. As Margaret climbed the grand staircase toward the Queen Consort's private apartments, her mind raced through the potential implications of the morning's revelations. Queen Consort Helena had never made her feelings about Catherine entirely clear, maintaining the diplomatic facade that royal protocol demanded. But Margaret had served long enough to read between the lines, to notice the subtle tensions during family gatherings, the careful way Helena chose her words when Catherine's name arose in conversation. The Queen Consort's apartments occupied the entire east wing of the palace's second floor, a testament to her position within the royal hierarchy. The rooms were decorated in Helena's preferred style of understated elegance, with antique furniture carefully chosen for both beauty and historical significance. Fresh flowers were arranged daily, and the morning light filtered through windows that overlooked the palace's private gardens. Margaret knocked softly on the outer door and waited for permission to enter. Helena's voice carried through the heavy oak, cultured and controlled as always. Inside, Margaret found the Queen Consort seated at her writing desk, already impeccably dressed despite the early hour. Helena's dark hair was styled in her signature chignon, and she wore a navy blue dress that spoke of quiet authority. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Margaret said, offering a respectful curtsy. "I have the morning papers." Helena looked up from her correspondence, her pale blue eyes immediately focusing on the stack of newspapers in Margaret's hands. There was something in her expression that Margaret couldn't quite identify, a flicker of anticipation mixed with what might have been concern. "Place them on the side table, please," Helena instructed, her voice betraying nothing of what she might be thinking. Margaret did as requested, arranging the papers in order of importance as she had been trained to do. The damaging headlines were impossible to ignore, even when folded and stacked. She could sense Helena's awareness of them, the way her eyes drifted toward the papers even as she maintained the pretense of focusing on her writing. "Will there be anything else, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked, though she suspected her services would be needed throughout what promised to be a turbulent day. "Not immediately," Helena replied, though she had already begun to reach for the top newspaper. "Please ensure that I am not disturbed for the next 30 minutes. Margaret withdrew to the antechamber, but she did not go far. 3 decades of palace service had taught her when to make herself scarce and when to remain within earshot. Today felt like the latter. She busied herself with small tasks, arranging flowers and dusting surfaces that were already immaculate, while keeping her ears attuned to any sounds from the inner chamber. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when she heard the sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like papers being thrown. Margaret froze, her hand still gripping the flower stems she had been adjusting. In all her years of service, she had never heard Queen Consort Helena lose her composure in such a manner. The sound of footsteps across the chamber floor was followed by the distinct crash of something hitting the wall. Margaret's heart began to race. Whatever Helena had read in those papers had provoked a reaction far beyond anything Margaret had witnessed before. The Queen Consort was known for her iron self-control, her ability to maintain perfect composure even in the most challenging circumstances. Margaret crept closer to the connecting door, her conscience warring with her curiosity. She knew she should retreat. She'd give her mistress privacy to process whatever had so disturbed her. But something about the situation felt momentous, as if she were witnessing a turning point in the history of the royal family. Through the slightly open door, she could see Helena standing by the window, her usually perfect posture rigid with tension. The newspapers were scattered across the Persian rug, their headlines visible even from Margaret's position. Helena's hands were clenched at her sides, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a venom that Margaret had never heard before. "How dare she?" Helena whispered, the words carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "After everything we have done for her, after all the compromises, all the accommodations." Margaret realized she was holding her breath, afraid that even the smallest sound would alert Helena to her presence. The Queen Consort began to pace, her movements sharp and agitated, so unlike her usual graceful composure. 15 years, Helena continued, her voice growing stronger. 15 years of pretending, of playing the supportive mother-in-law, of watching her bask in adoration that should have been reserved for the true royals. Margaret's mind reeled as she processed Helena's words. The relationship between the Queen Consort and Princess Catherine had always seemed cordial, if not warm. Public appearances showed them working together seamlessly, supporting the same charities, attending the same events with apparent harmony. The revelation of such deep-seated resentment was shocking. Helena stopped pacing and picked up one of the newspapers from the floor. Even from her hidden position, Margaret could see the tension in every line of the Queen Consort's body. "The people's princess," Helena said with bitter irony. "Their beloved Catherine. Well, let us see how beloved she remains when the truth comes out." The implication in Helena's voice made Margaret's blood run cold. There was something almost predatory in the way she spoke, as if the headlines were not merely unfortunate news, but an opportunity she had been waiting for. Helena moved to her desk and pulled out a leather-bound address book. Margaret watched as she flipped through the pages with purpose, clearly searching for specific contacts. The Queen Consort's expression had shifted from anger to something more calculating, more dangerous. "Lord Pemberton will want to know about this immediately," Helena murmured to herself. "And Lady Ashworth. Yes, they will both be very interested indeed." Margaret knew both names well. Lord Pemberton was one of the most influential members of the House of Lords, and a longtime family friend. Lady Ashworth controlled one of the largest media empires in the country, and had significant sway over public opinion. The fact that Helena was planning to contact them so quickly suggested a level of premeditation that Margaret found deeply troubling. The sound of Helena reaching for the telephone galvanized Margaret into action. She quickly retreated from her position, moving as silently as possible back to the antechamber. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the palace. As she busied herself with meaningless tasks, Margaret's mind raced through the implications of what she had witnessed. The Queen Consort's reaction went far beyond simple disapproval of negative press coverage. There was a personal animosity there, a resentment that had apparently been festering for years beneath the surface of royal protocol. Margaret thought about Princess Catherine, about the woman she had come to respect and admire over the years. Catherine had always treated the staff with kindness and consideration, had genuinely cared about the causes she supported, had brought a humanity to the royal family that had been missing for generations. The thought that she might be destroyed by palace intrigue and carefully orchestrated media manipulation made Margaret feel physically ill. From the inner chamber she could hear Helena's voice on the telephone, though the words were too muffled to make out clearly. The tone, however, was unmistakable. There was satisfaction in it. A sense of pieces falling into place according to some predetermined plan. Margaret realized that she was now in possession of information that could have far-reaching consequences. The loyal part of her, the part that had been trained through decades of service to maintain absolute discretion, urged her to forget what she had seen and heard. But another part, The part that had grown to care genuinely for the members of the royal family she served wondered if remaining silent was truly the right course of action. The telephone conversation ended, and Margaret heard Helena's footsteps approaching the door. She quickly busied herself with rearranging items on a side table, trying to appear as if she had been productively occupied the entire time. Helena emerged from her private chamber, her composure completely restored. To anyone else, she would have appeared exactly as she always did, perfectly controlled and regally composed. But Margaret now knew how to look beneath the surface, and what she saw there chilled her to the bone. "Lady Margaret," Helena said, her voice pleasant and measured, "please arrange for tea to be served in my sitting room at 11 o'clock. I will be receiving Lord Pemberton and Lady Ashworth." "Of course, Your Majesty," Margaret replied, hoping her voice betrayed none of her inner turmoil. As Helena returned to her chamber, Margaret stood alone in the antechamber, the weight of her knowledge pressing down upon her like a physical burden. She had always prided herself on her discretion, on her ability to serve the royal family with absolute loyalty and silence, but she had never before been faced with a situation where that loyalty might conflict with what was right. The morning sun had finally burned through the mist, casting the palace grounds in golden light. But for Margaret, the day ahead seemed shrouded in shadow, filled with moral complexities she was ill-equipped to navigate. She had become an unwilling witness to what might be the beginning of Princess Catherine's downfall, and the knowledge of Helena's role in it would haunt her every waking moment. The palace's ancient corridors seemed to whisper with secrets as Margaret made her way through the familiar passages toward the kitchen quarters. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors, each sound a reminder of the weight she now carried. The revelation of Queen Consort Helena's true feelings toward Princess Catherine had shattered Margaret's understanding of the royal household's dynamics, leaving her feeling unmoored and uncertain. The kitchen staff had been bustling since before dawn, preparing for the day's formal meals and the numerous tea services required throughout the palace. Margaret found Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, the head cook, directing operations with her usual efficiency. Eleanor had been with the royal household almost as long as Margaret, and the two women had developed a mutual respect over the decades of service. "Good morning, Eleanor," Margaret said, approaching the older woman who stood reviewing the day's menu. "Her Majesty will be taking tea in her private sitting room at 11 o'clock. Lord Pemberton and Lady Ashworth will be joining her." Eleanor looked up from her papers, her weathered face showing mild surprise. "Rather sudden, isn't it? And an interesting combination of guests for such an informal setting." Margaret nodded, appreciating Eleanor's astute observation. Lord Pemberton rarely visited the Queen Consort's private apartments, preferring the formality of the main reception rooms. Lady Ashworth, meanwhile, was known for conducting her business meetings in restaurants and private clubs rather than palace settings. The choice of venue suggested a desire for absolute privacy. "I suspect it has something to do with the morning papers," Margaret said carefully, testing the waters to see if Eleanor had noticed the troubling headlines. Eleanor's expression darkened slightly. "Ah, yes, I saw them when young Timothy delivered the stack. Terrible business, all those accusations about Princess Catherine. Though, I must say, I find it difficult to believe any of it." Margaret felt a surge of relief at Eleanor's words. If the kitchen staff, who often knew the royal family's true characters better than anyone, doubted the validity of the claims, perhaps there was hope that the public would see through the fabrications as well. "The princess has always been nothing but gracious when she visits the kitchens," Eleanor continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Remembers all our names, asks about our families, even helped young Sarah with her reading lessons when she was struggling. Not the behavior of someone with the character flaws those papers are suggesting." Margaret absorbed this information, adding it to her growing certainty that the attacks on Catherine were orchestrated rather than organic. She thought about Helena's reaction that morning, the satisfaction in her voice when she spoke of seeing how beloved Catherine would remain once the truth came out. But what if the truth was not what the papers claimed? "Eleanor," Margaret said slowly, "have you ever noticed any particular tension between Her Majesty and the princess?" The older woman paused in her work, considering the question carefully. "Nothing overt, mind you, but there have been moments over the years. Little things that you might not notice unless you are watching carefully." "What sort of things?" Eleanor glanced around the kitchen to ensure they would not be overheard, then moved closer to Margaret. "Well, there was the incident last Christmas when the princess suggested changes to the traditional menu to accommodate some of the newer staff members who had dietary restrictions. The Queen Consort agreed publicly, of course, but I received very specific instructions later about maintaining certain traditions regardless of the princess's preferences. Margaret frowned, remembering her own observations from that period. There had been an unusual number of private meetings between Helena and various palace officials, discussions that seemed to focus on protocol and proper procedures. And then there was the matter of the princess's charitable work, Eleanor continued. You know how she's always championing causes for ordinary people, homeless shelters, mental health initiatives, programs for working mothers. Well-meaning, certainly, but perhaps not quite in line with the more traditional approach to royal philanthropy. The Queen Consort disapproves? Not openly, but there have been suggestions that the princess might benefit from guidance about appropriate causes for royal patronage. Nothing direct, you understand, but implications that some of her choices might be seen as too political or too common. Margaret processed this information, building a clearer picture of the underlying tensions she had been too discreet to notice before. Helena's world was one of tradition, protocol, and maintaining the mystique of royal distance. Catherine's approach was warmer, more accessible, more connected to the everyday experiences of ordinary people. The conflict between these philosophies had apparently been simmering beneath the surface for years. There's something else, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Last month, when the princess was visiting the children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital, someone from the Queen Consort's office called to confirm her schedule. Very detailed questions about timing, about which reporters would be present, about what she planned to discuss with the families. That seems unusual. The princess's charity work has always been managed by her own staff. There was no reason for the Queen Consort's office to be involved unless... Eleanor trailed off. But her implication was clear. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fit together, creating a picture that was far more sinister than she had initially realized. Helena's reaction to the morning papers was not surprise or disappointment, but satisfaction at a plan coming to fruition. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted their conversation. Both women immediately returned to their tasks, maintaining the appearance of routine morning preparations. A young footman appeared in the doorway, breathless from what appeared to be a hurried journey through the palace. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Kerr."
"Hastings," the young man said, "but there's been a change to the lunch arrangements."
"Princess Catherine will not be joining the family today. Her private secretary called to say she's been advised to remain at Rosewood House until further notice." Margaret's heart sank. Rosewood House was Catherine and Alexander's private residence, located about an hour's drive from the main palace. For Catherine to be advised to remain there suggested that the situation was far more serious than a simple media controversy. Someone was actively working to isolate her from the family and the palace support system. "Did the private secretary say anything else?" Eleanor asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Only that all of the princess's public engagements for the next week have been cancelled as a precautionary measure." After the footman left, Margaret and Eleanor exchanged worried glances. A week's cancellation of royal engagements was virtually unprecedented unless there was a serious illness or security threat. The speed with which these decisions were being made suggested a level of preparation that could not have been improvised in response to morning headlines. "This isn't right," Eleanor murmured. The princess wouldn't just hide away unless someone was making her feel she had no choice. Margaret nodded, her resolve beginning to solidify. She thought about Catherine's kindness over the years, the genuine care she had shown for everyone from senior courtiers to the youngest kitchen maids. The woman who had revolutionized royal engagement with charitable causes, who had brought warmth and humanity to an institution often criticized for being cold and distant, deserved better than to be destroyed by palace intrigue. "Eleanor," Margaret said carefully, "if someone wanted to discredit the princess, how would they go about it?" The older woman considered the question seriously. "Well, you would need access to her private schedule to know when she was most vulnerable to observation or misinterpretation. You would need connections in the media to ensure that your version of events received prominent coverage, and you would need the appearance of multiple independent sources to make the accusation seem credible rather than coordinated, all of which would require resources and connections that most people don't possess." Gag. Exactly. This sort of character assassination requires institutional support, the kind that only comes from the highest levels of power. Margaret felt the weight of her knowledge pressing down upon her even more heavily. She was now certain that she was witnessing a deliberate campaign to destroy Princess Catherine, orchestrated by someone with access to the palace's inner workings and significant influence over media coverage. The question that remained was what, if anything, she could do about it. Her position in the royal household depended on absolute discretion and loyalty. Speaking out against the Queen Consort would be career suicide and might well result in legal consequences. But remaining silent felt like complicity in an injustice that would harm not only Catherine, but the monarchy itself. "Margaret," Eleanor said softly, "whatever you're thinking, be very careful. These people play for keeps, and they don't hesitate to destroy anyone who gets in their way." Before Margaret could respond, another servant appeared with word that Lord Pemberton's car had been spotted approaching the palace gates. The clandestine meeting was about to begin, and Margaret needed to return to her duties in the Queen Consort's apartments. As she made her way back through the corridors, Margaret's mind raced through possible courses of action. She could try to document what she observed, though the risk of discovery was enormous. She could attempt to warn Princess Catherine, though reaching her now that she had been isolated at Rosewood House would be nearly impossible. Or she could continue to observe and gather information, building a clearer picture of the conspiracy before deciding how to act. The palace's great clock chimed 10:30 as Margaret approached Helena's apartments. Lord Pemberton's arrival was imminent, and she needed to ensure that everything was properly prepared for the meeting that might determine Princess Catherine's fate. Whatever was discussed in the next few hours, Margaret was determined to be positioned where she could observe and remember every detail. The game for the future of the monarchy was about to begin in earnest, and Margaret realized that she might be the only person in a position to ensure that truth would ultimately prevail over orchestrated deception. The question was whether she would have the courage to act on what she learned, knowing that the consequences of intervention might destroy her own life even as she tried to save Catherine's reputation. The grandfather clock in the Queen Consort's antechamber struck 11 as Margaret heard the distinctive purr of Lord Pemberton's Bentley on the gravel drive below. She positioned herself at the window, ostensibly arranging fresh flowers, while observing the arrival of Helena's first conspirator. Lord Pemberton emerged from his vehicle with the confident stride of a man accustomed to wielding power behind the scenes. His silver hair caught the morning light as he adjusted his perfectly tailored coat and made his way toward the palace's private entrance. Margaret had served Lord Pemberton tea on numerous occasions over the years, and had always found him to be courteous, if somewhat distant. He was old-school aristocracy, a man who believed deeply in tradition and hierarchy. His political influence extended far beyond his official position, and his opinions carried significant weight among the conservative establishment that still held considerable sway over public perception of the royal family. Within minutes, a soft knock on the outer door announced his arrival. Margaret opened it to find Lord Pemberton accompanied by Davies, one of the palace's senior footmen. The older man's pale blue eyes held a sharpness that Margaret had not noticed during their previous encounters, as if today's business had awakened something predatory in his nature. "Your lordship," Margaret said with a respectful curtsy, "Her Majesty is expecting you." Lord Pemberton nodded curtly and moved toward the inner chamber without his usual pleasantries. Margaret noticed that he carried a leather briefcase, unusual for what was supposedly a social call. Whatever documents were contained within that case, she suspected they were central to the morning's agenda. Helena emerged from her private chamber before Margaret could announce the visitor, suggesting she had been watching from her window as well. The Queen Consort had changed her attire since the morning, now wearing a burgundy dress that spoke of serious business rather than casual conversation. "Richard," Helena said, extending her hand with a warmth that seemed genuine. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Helena, my dear," Lord Pemberton replied, taking her hand in both of his. "When you call with such urgency, I naturally assume the matter is of considerable importance." "Indeed it is. Please, let us sit." "Margaret, we will take our tea in exactly 20 minutes. Until then, we are not to be disturbed under any circumstances." Margaret curtsied again and withdrew to the antechamber, though she was careful to position herself where she might overhear fragments of the conversation. The heavy oak door remained slightly ajar, and voices carried more clearly than Helena might have realized. "I trust you have seen this morning's papers." Helena's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Devastating coverage," Lord Pemberton replied. "Though, I must admit, some of the allegations seem rather extreme. Are we certain they will stand up to scrutiny? That is precisely why I asked you here. The stories themselves are only the beginning. We need to ensure that the narrative becomes self-sustaining, that additional revelations continue to emerge, even if the initial claims are challenged." Margaret's hands began to tremble as she processed the implication of Helena's words. The Queen Consort was not merely reacting to negative coverage of Princess Catherine. She was actively orchestrating an ongoing campaign to destroy her daughter-in-law's reputation. "I have prepared some supplementary materials," Lord Pemberton said, and Margaret heard the sound of papers being shuffled. "Careful analysis of the princess's public statements over the past 5 years reveals several comments that could be interpreted as politically inappropriate when taken out of context. What about her charitable activities? Several of her chosen causes have connections to organizations that have been critical of government policy. With proper presentation, her support for homeless shelters and mental health programs could be portrayed as tacit endorsement of anti-establishment positions. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling sick at the calculated nature of their discussion. They were systematically twisting Catherine's greatest strengths into perceived weaknesses, transforming her compassion into political liability and her accessibility into impropriety. And the financial aspects? Helena asked. We have identified several instances where the princess's household expenses exceeded traditional guidelines. Nothing inappropriate, of course, but when presented alongside questions about her judgment in other areas, it contributes to a pattern of irresponsibility. Perfect. Elizabeth should be arriving shortly, and she will want specific talking points for her editorial teams. Margaret realized that Helena was referring to Lady Elizabeth Ashworth, whose media empire controlled several major newspapers and influential online platforms. The coordination between Helena, Lord Pemberton, and Lady Ashworth represented a convergence of royal influence, political power, and media control that could shape public opinion on a massive scale. The sound of another vehicle on the gravel drive confirmed that Lady Ashworth had indeed arrived. Margaret moved back to the window and observed a sleek black car disgorging a woman whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was legendary throughout London's power circles. Lady Ashworth was younger than her two co-conspirators, perhaps in her early 50s, but her influence in shaping public discourse was arguably greater than either of theirs. Margaret opened the door before Lady Ashworth had a chance to knock, finding herself face to face with a woman whose sharp green eyes seemed to assess and categorize everything they encountered. Unlike Lord Pemberton's old-fashioned courtesy, Lady Ashworth offered only a curt nod before proceeding directly toward Helena's inner chamber. "Elizabeth, darling." Alina's voice carried clearly as she greeted her newest ally. "I trust the morning's publications met with your approval?" "A good beginning," Lady Ashworth replied, her voice crisp and businesslike. "But we need to maintain momentum if we want lasting impact. Public attention spans are notoriously short, and the princess has considerable reserves of goodwill to overcome." Margaret positioned herself as close to the door as she dared, desperate to understand the full scope of the conspiracy unfolding in the next room. The three voices blended together as they discussed strategy with the cold efficiency of military planners. "The key is to avoid appearing coordinated," Lady Ashworth was saying. "My editors will need to believe they are pursuing independent investigations rather than following a predetermined narrative." "How do you manage that?" Lord Pemberton asked. "Carefully placed anonymous tips, leaked documents that appear to come from multiple sources, strategic timing of revelations to suggest organic development rather than orchestrated release. It requires considerable finesse, but the results are far more credible than obvious propaganda." Margaret felt her knees weaken as she understood the sophisticated nature of the attack being launched against Catherine. This was not simple palace gossip or media sensationalism. It was a carefully planned campaign of destruction utilizing the most powerful tools available to shape public perception. "What about Prince Alexander?" Helena asked. "He will naturally want to defend his wife. That actually works in our favor," Lady Ashworth replied. "If he appears too defensive, it suggests there might be truth to the allegations. If he remains silent, it implies doubt about her innocence. Either response can be spun to our advantage. And if he attempts to investigate the sources of these stories, the paper trail has been carefully constructed to lead nowhere useful. Any investigation will encounter dead ends and misdirection that will frustrate rather than illuminate." Margaret realized that Prince Alexander, despite his position and resources, was being systematically outmaneuvered by people who had spent decades perfecting the art of palace intrigue. Catherine was not just facing negative publicity, she was confronting a coordinated assault from individuals who understood exactly how to weaponize the media against her. "Now," Helena continued, "let us discuss the timeline for additional revelations." "Elizabeth, what is your assessment of optimal pacing?"
"We need to space things carefully," Lady Ashworth replied. "Too quick, and it appears suspicious.
Too slow, and public interest wanes. I suggest a major follow-up story within 48 hours, followed by smaller revelations spaced over the next 2 weeks." "What sort of follow-up story?" "Something that appears to corroborate the initial allegations while introducing new areas of concern. Perhaps questions about her influence over royal decisions, or suggestions that her common background has led to inappropriate behavior in formal settings." Margaret's heart raced as she realized that Catherine had no idea what was coming. The princess was probably at Rosewood House believing that the morning's negative coverage would blow over in a few days, unaware that it was merely the opening salvo in a sustained campaign designed to destroy her completely. "Richard," Helena said, "what about political support? Can we count on government sources to avoid defending her too vigorously?" "Several key ministers have already been briefed on the situation," Lord Pemberton replied. "They understand that royal stability requires addressing problems before they become crises. There will be no official criticism of the princess, but neither will there be robust defense." "Excellent. The appearance of government neutrality will lend credibility to the suggestion that these allegations are serious enough to warrant official concern." Margaret realized that the conspiracy extended far beyond the royal household and media companies. Government officials were apparently complicit in the campaign, creating an environment where Catherine would find herself isolated from all the traditional sources of institutional support. The sound of movement in the inner chamber alerted Margaret that the meeting was approaching some sort of conclusion. She quickly moved to the tea service, preparing to fulfill her earlier instructions while trying to process everything she had overheard. "Margaret," Helena called, "please serve tea now." Margaret entered the chamber carrying the silver tea service, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. The three conspirators were seated around Helena's intimate sitting area, papers spread across the low table between them. Margaret caught glimpses of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline as she arranged the tea service. "Thank you, Margaret," Helena said dismissively. "Please close the door behind you and ensure we continue to have privacy." As Margaret withdrew, she heard Lady Ashworth comment, "The staff seem very discreet. No concerns about information leaking from household sources?" "None whatsoever," Helena replied confidently. "The servants here understand their place and their obligations. Absolute loyalty has been the foundation of their employment for decades." The casual assumption that Margaret and her colleagues would remain silent while witnessing injustice stung more than any direct insult could have. Helena saw the palace staff as mere furniture, useful for their services but incapable of independent thought or moral judgment. Margaret returned to the antechamber, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. The conspiracy against Princess Catherine was far more extensive and sophisticated than she had initially realized. It involved royal family members, political figures, media moguls, and government officials working in coordination to destroy a woman whose only crime was failing to conform to traditional expectations of royal behavior. The question that tormented Margaret was what she could possibly do with this knowledge. She was a lady's maid, a servant whose word would carry no weight against such powerful accusers. Any attempt to warn Catherine or expose the conspiracy would likely result in her immediate dismissal and possible legal action for breach of confidentiality. Yet the alternative was to remain silent, while witnessing the systematic destruction of an innocent woman who had brought joy and humanity to the royal family. Catherine had always treated Margaret and her colleagues with respect and kindness, had genuinely cared about the causes she supported, and had earned the love of the people through her authentic compassion rather than calculated public relations. As Margaret sat in the antechamber, listening to the muffled voices of the conspirators planning Catherine's downfall, she realized that her 30 years of loyal service had led her to this moment of moral crisis. The question was whether her loyalty to the institution of the monarchy was stronger than her loyalty to justice and truth. The meeting in the inner chamber continued for another hour, with Margaret catching occasional fragments of conversation about media strategy, political coordination, and timeline management. When the three conspirators finally emerged, they appeared satisfied with their morning's work. The campaign to destroy Princess Catherine was officially underway, and Margaret was the only person outside their circle who understood the full scope of what was being unleashed. The afternoon shadows stretched long across Pemberton Palace as Margaret went about her duties with mechanical precision, her mind consumed by the morning's revelations. The conspiracy against Princess Catherine was now in motion, and Margaret could see its effects beginning to ripple through the palace like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Staff members whispered in corners, their conversations stopping abruptly when senior courtiers passed by. The atmosphere had shifted from normal palace routine to something far more tense and uncertain. Margaret had spent her lunch break in the servants' quarters, listening carefully to the conversations around her. The kitchen staff were discussing the princess's sudden retreat to Rosewood House, with several expressing concern about the unprecedented nature of her isolation. The housekeeping staff had noticed increased security measures and several unexpected visits from officials Margaret didn't recognize. Most telling of all, she had overheard two of the Queen Consort's other ladies-in-waiting discussing preparations for what they termed an indefinite period of modified protocols. As she returned to Helena's apartments for the afternoon session, Margaret carried with her the weight of knowledge that made every routine task feel significant. She was no longer simply serving tea and arranging flowers. She was witnessing history unfold, and her position gave her unique access to information that could potentially alter the course of events. Helena was in her private study when Margaret arrived, surrounded by correspondence and what appeared to be detailed briefing documents. The Queen Consort's earlier satisfaction had evolved into something more focused and businesslike, as if the morning's planning session had energized her for the work ahead. "Ah, Margaret," Helena said without looking up from her papers. "I need you to make several telephone calls this afternoon. Please contact Lady Morrison and inform her that I would like to schedule tea for tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Also, please arrange for Sir Geoffrey Whitman to visit at his earliest convenience, and send my regards to the Duchess of Westbridge with a request for her to call me this evening." Margaret recognized all three names as influential figures in London society, each with their own networks of connections and their own reasons to be interested in royal family developments. Lady Morrison was known for her involvement in several high-profile charities that might compete with Catherine's preferred causes. Sir Geoffrey Whitman held significant sway over traditional conservative organisations that valued protocol and hierarchy above accessibility and modernisation. The Duchess of Westbridge controlled one of the most exclusive social circles in the country and had the power to influence how the aristocracy would respond to the unfolding scandal. "Of course, Your Majesty," Margaret replied, making careful mental notes of each contact. The pattern was becoming clear. Helena was systematically reaching out to every person who might have influence over public opinion, building a network of support for her campaign against Catherine. As Margaret began making the requested calls, she listened carefully to Helena's side of various other conversations taking place throughout the afternoon. The Queen Consort was in contact with an impressive array of individuals, from newspaper editors to charity leaders to prominent socialites. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: expressions of concern about recent developments, subtle suggestions that perhaps the princess had always shown signs of poor judgment, and careful implications that those who valued stability might want to distance themselves from association with Catherine's causes. Margaret was particularly struck by a conversation Helena held with the chairman of the Children's Foundation, one of Catherine's most prominent charitable patronages. Helena's voice was concerned but reasonable, as she suggested that the foundation might want to consider whether continued association with the princess would be beneficial for their mission. "Of course, we must all hope that these allegations prove unfounded," Helena said smoothly. "But in the meantime, the foundation has a responsibility to its beneficiaries to avoid any appearance of endorsing behavior that might be seen as inappropriate. Perhaps a temporary suspension of the princess's official role would be prudent until the situation clarifies itself." Margaret realized that Helena was systematically dismantling Catherine's support network, one relationship at a time. By framing her suggestions as concern for the organizations rather than attacks on Catherine, she was making it difficult for anyone to refuse her requests without appearing irresponsible themselves. The most chilling conversation occurred late in the afternoon, when Helena spoke with someone she addressed only as Charles. Margaret gathered from context that this was likely Sir Charles Blackwood, the royal family's longtime legal advisor, and a man whose discretion and influence were legendary. "Charles, darling," Helena began, "I wanted to discuss some concerns that have come to my attention regarding Princess Catherine's conduct. Nothing formal at this stage, of course, but perhaps you could review the relevant protocols for situations where a royal's behavior might be considered detrimental to the institution." Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized that Helena was exploring legal avenues to formalize Catherine's removal from royal duties. This was no longer simply a media campaign. It was potentially the groundwork for stripping Catherine of her title and position entirely. "Yes, I understand the sensitivity," Helena continued, "but we must consider the long-term health of the monarchy. If these allegations prove to have substance, we need to be prepared to act decisively to protect the institution from further damage." The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, with Helena discussing precedents for royal family members being quietly encouraged to step back from public roles. Margaret understood enough of the legal terminology to realize that Helena was building a case for Catherine's effective exile from the royal family, couched in language about protecting the monarchy's reputation and ensuring appropriate conduct standards. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret became increasingly aware of the sophistication and thoroughness of the campaign being waged against Catherine. This was not a spontaneous reaction to negative publicity. It was a carefully planned operation that had probably been months in development. Every potential avenue of support for Catherine was being systematically closed off. Every possible refuge was being eliminated, and every legal mechanism for her removal was being explored and prepared. The most heartbreaking moment came when Helena received a call from Prince Alexander himself. Margaret could hear only Helena's side of the conversation. But it was clear that Catherine's husband was desperate for guidance and support in dealing with the crisis affecting his wife. "Alexander, my dear boy," Helena said with perfectly performed maternal concern. "Of course I understand how difficult this must be for you. Catherine is family, and we all want what is best for her." There was a pause as Alexander spoke, and Margaret could imagine the anguish in his voice as he tried to defend his wife against allegations that he probably didn't fully understand. "I think the most important thing right now is to ensure that she has proper support and guidance," Helena continued. "Perhaps some time away from the public eye would be beneficial while this situation resolves itself. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to allow someone to step back before the pressure becomes overwhelming." Margaret realized that Helena was manipulating her own stepson, using his love for Catherine against both of them. By framing isolation and removal from royal duties as protective measures rather than punishments, she was making it appear that Alexander himself was choosing to limit his wife's role in the royal family. "Of course, if you feel that professional counseling might be helpful for Catherine, I can recommend several discreet practitioners who understand the unique pressures of royal life," Helena added. And Margaret understood that she was suggesting that Catherine needed psychiatric help, further undermining her credibility and competence. The conversation ended with Alexander apparently agreeing to keep Catherine at Rosewood House indefinitely and to consider various forms of professional support that Helena recommended. Margaret realized that the prince, in his desire to protect his wife, was actually playing directly into Helena's hands by isolating Catherine from the palace and the public. As evening approached, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the scope and cruelty of what she had witnessed. Helena had managed to manipulate media coverage, political support, charitable relationships, legal frameworks, and even family dynamics to create an impossible situation for Catherine. Every avenue of defense had been closed off. Every potential ally had been neutralized and every escape route had been blocked. The princess, who had been beloved by the public just 24 hours earlier, was now facing complete destruction of her reputation, removal from her charitable roles, potential legal action, questions about her mental health, and isolation from both her family and her supporters. All of this had been accomplished through careful manipulation and coordination rather than any actual wrongdoing on Catherine's part. Margaret realized that Catherine probably had no idea of the full scope of what she was facing. Isolated at Rosewood House with only her immediate household staff and her husband, she would be receiving filtered information that made her situation appear less dire than it actually was. Alexander's well-meaning attempts to protect her were actually preventing her from understanding the magnitude of the conspiracy against her and taking appropriate defensive action. As Margaret prepared to leave Helena's apartments for the evening, the Queen Consort called her back for one final instruction. "Margaret," Helena said, her voice casual but her eyes sharp, "I want you to understand that the matters we have discussed today are of the utmost sensitivity. The royal family's reputation depends on absolute discretion from all members of the household staff. I trust I can count on your complete loyalty." And silence. "Of course, Your Majesty," Margaret replied, though the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "Excellent. These are challenging times for all of us, but I am confident that we will emerge stronger if we all do our duty as we have been trained to do." As Margaret curtsied and withdrew, she understood that Helena's words were both instruction and warning. The Queen Consort was reminding her that her position, her livelihood, and possibly her future all depended on maintaining silence about what she had witnessed. Walking through the palace corridors toward her own quarters, Margaret felt the weight of 30 years of loyal service pressing down upon her. She had always taken pride in her discretion, her reliability, and her absolute commitment to serving the royal family. But now those very qualities were being used to enable an injustice that violated everything she believed about duty, honor, and protecting those who deserved protection. The question that would torment her through the sleepless night ahead was whether true loyalty to the monarchy required her to protect its reputation by remaining silent or to protect its integrity by exposing the conspiracy that was destroying one of its most valuable members. Margaret realized that her decision in the coming days would define not only Catherine's fate, but her own understanding of what service and honor truly meant. The pre-dawn hours found Margaret sitting by her small window, watching the first pale light creep across the palace grounds. She had not slept, her mind churning through the events of the previous day and the impossible choice that lay before her. In just 48 hours, her understanding of the royal household had been completely shattered, replaced by a dark vision of manipulation and calculated cruelty that made her question everything she had believed about duty and loyalty. Margaret had spent the night reviewing every interaction she had witnessed, every telephone conversation she had overheard, every document she had glimpsed. The evidence of conspiracy was overwhelming, but the challenge of acting on that evidence seemed insurmountable. She was a servant, bound by contracts and traditions that demanded absolute silence. Speaking out would mean destroying her own life to save Catherine's, with no guarantee that her sacrifice would be effective. Yet, as the morning light strengthened, Margaret found herself thinking not about her own situation, but about Catherine's kindness over the years. She remembered the princess visiting the servants' quarters during last year's flu outbreak, bringing soup and checking on the sick staff members personally. She recalled Catherine's genuine interest in Margaret's own family, the way she had sent flowers when Margaret's sister passed away, the small gestures of humanity that had made service feel like more than just employment. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside reminded Margaret that another day of her complicity was about to begin. Helena would expect her to continue serving tea and arranging meetings while the campaign against Catherine intensified. The morning papers would carry new allegations, carefully planted stories that would further erode the princess's reputation and support base. Margaret rose from her chair with sudden resolve. She could not continue to be a passive witness to injustice, regardless of the personal cost. If Catherine was to have any chance of survival, someone needed to act on the information that only Margaret possessed. The question was not whether to act, but how to act effectively. Her first step was to document what she had witnessed. Margaret retrieved a small notebook from her personal effects and began writing a careful account of everything she had seen and heard over the past 2 days. She recorded times, names, specific conversations, and the clear evidence of coordination between Helena, Lord Pemberton, Lady Ashworth, and their various allies. The process of writing helped her organize her thoughts and recognize the full scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. As she wrote, Margaret realized that her documentation alone would not be sufficient. She needed some way to corroborate her account, to provide evidence that would be credible to someone in a position to help Catherine. The challenge was that most of the conspiracy had been conducted verbally, leaving little physical evidence behind. Then Margaret remembered the papers she had seen spread across Helena's table during the meeting with the conspirators. There had been photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline. If she could somehow obtain copies of those materials, they would provide concrete proof of the premeditated nature of the campaign against Catherine. The risk of attempting to access Helena's private papers was enormous. Discovery would mean immediate dismissal, possible criminal charges, and almost certain personal destruction. But Margaret realized that she had already passed the point of no return by deciding to act. The choice was between certain moral failure through inaction or possible personal destruction through intervention. Margaret spent the early morning hours developing a plan. Helena typically left her apartments around 10 o'clock for her daily walk in the private gardens, a routine that would provide a brief window of opportunity. The Queen Consort's study would be locked, but Margaret had observed that Helena often left documents on her desk during short absences, trusting that her private apartments would not be disturbed. As the palace stirred to life around her, Margaret prepared for what might be her final day of service. She dressed carefully in her usual uniform, made herself presentable, and gathered the supplies she would need for her normal duties. To any observer, she would appear exactly as she had every morning for 30 years. Helena was already awake when Margaret arrived at her apartments, reading the morning papers with evident satisfaction. The headlines were even worse than the previous day, with new allegations about Catherine's conduct and suggestions from unnamed royal sources that the princess might be facing serious consequences for her behavior.
"Good morning, Your Majesty," Margaret said, maintaining her usual professional demeanor, despite the revulsion she felt at Helena's obvious pleasure in Catherine's suffering.
"Margaret, excellent," Helena replied. "I need you to arrange several important calls for this morning. Please contact the editors of the Royal Observer, the Daily Crown, and Westminster today. I want to speak with each of them personally about their coverage of recent events." Margaret understood that Helena was preparing to coordinate the next phase of the media campaign, ensuring that the coverage continued to intensify rather than diminishing as the initial shock wore off. Each conversation would provide editors with new angles to pursue, additional sources to contact, and subtle guidance about how to frame their ongoing coverage. "Also," Helena continued, "please prepare the Blue Sitting Room for a meeting at 11 o'clock. Sir Charles Blackwood will be visiting to discuss some legal matters, and I want to ensure complete privacy for our conversation." The mention of legal matters confirmed Margaret's worst fears about the direction the conspiracy was heading. Helena was not content with destroying Catherine's reputation. She was apparently preparing legal mechanisms to formalize her removal from the royal family entirely. As Margaret went about her morning duties, making the requested telephone calls and preparing the sitting room, she finalized her plans for accessing Helena's study. The Queen Consort's daily walk was scheduled for 10:15 and typically lasted 30 minutes. Sir Charles would not arrive until 11, providing a brief window when the apartments would be empty and unguarded. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness as Margaret waited for her opportunity. Helena conducted her telephone conversations with the newspaper editors, providing each with carefully crafted talking points and anonymous tips that would fuel additional days of negative coverage. Margaret listened to these conversations with growing anger, noting how skillfully Helena manipulated the truth to create damaging impressions without making statements that could be directly challenged. Finally, at exactly 10:15, Helena departed for her garden walk. Margaret waited 5 additional minutes to ensure that the Queen Consort would not return unexpectedly, then made her way to the study door. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the handle, but she found the door unlocked as she had hoped. Helena's study was a monument to organized efficiency, with documents carefully arranged in file folders and correspondence sorted into neat piles. Margaret's eyes immediately found the papers from the previous day's conspiracy meeting, still arranged on a side table, where Helena had been reviewing them throughout the morning. The documents were even more damning than Margaret had expected. She found detailed psychological profiles of Catherine, analyzing her personality for potential weaknesses that could be exploited. There were financial records that had been carefully edited to suggest impropriety where none existed. Most shocking of all, she discovered what appeared to be a comprehensive timeline, showing that planning for the campaign against Catherine had begun more than 6 months earlier. Margaret used her mobile phone to photograph as many documents as possible, working quickly but carefully to ensure that she captured clear images of the most incriminating materials. Her hands remained steady despite her fear, driven by the certainty that this evidence could potentially save Catherine if it reached the right person. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside sent Margaret's heart racing. She quickly returned the documents to their original positions and moved to the window, pretending to adjust the curtains as the door opened behind her. "Margaret?" Helena's voice carried a note of surprise. "What are you doing in my study?" Margaret turned slowly, her mind racing to construct a plausible explanation. "I apologize, Your Majesty. I noticed that the morning sun was creating a glare on your desk, and I thought you might prefer the curtains adjusted before Sir Charles arrives." Helena's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Margaret's face. For a moment, Margaret was certain that her deception had been discovered. Then Helena nodded curtly and moved toward her desk.
"In the future, please ask before entering my private study," Helena said.
"Now, Sir Charles has arrived early. Please show him to the blue sitting room and inform him that I will join him shortly." Margaret curtsied and withdrew, her heart pounding so violently she was certain it could be heard throughout the palace. She had succeeded in obtaining the evidence she needed, but Helena's unexpected return had created new risks. The Queen Consort was clearly suspicious, and any further investigation of Margaret's behavior would quickly reveal her betrayal. As she escorted Sir Charles to the sitting room, Margaret realized that her time for action was running out. Helena's legal consultation with Sir Charles would likely finalize the mechanisms for Catherine's removal from royal duties. Once those procedures were in place, even dramatic revelations about the conspiracy might not be sufficient to save the princess's position. Margaret spent the remainder of the morning in an agony of indecision about how to use the evidence she had gathered. She could not simply send the photographs to a newspaper, as they would likely be dismissed as fabrications or refused publication to avoid legal retaliation. She needed to find someone with both the credibility to be believed and the power to act on the information effectively. The solution came to her as she was serving lunch to the junior staff. She overheard a conversation about Prince Alexander's private secretary, David Morrison, who had been trying desperately to find ways to help Catherine respond to the crisis. Morrison was known for his loyalty to both Prince Alexander and Princess Catherine, and his position would give him access to resources that could potentially counter the conspiracy. Margaret realized that Morrison might be her only hope for getting the evidence to someone who could act on it effectively. But contacting him would require her to leave the palace, something that would immediately alert Helena to her activities. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was to watch Catherine's destruction proceed without any attempt at intervention. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Margaret made her final preparations. She copied the most damaging photographs to a secure digital storage device and wrote a detailed letter explaining the context of the evidence and the full scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Tomorrow, she would find a way to deliver this information to David Morrison, regardless of the consequences to herself. That night, Margaret sat once again by her window, watching the lights of London twinkle in the distance. She thought about the life she was about to sacrifice and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But she also thought about Catherine, isolated at Rosewood House, and facing complete destruction because of carefully orchestrated lies and manipulation. For 30 years, Margaret had served the royal family with absolute loyalty and discretion. Tomorrow, she would commit what many would consider the ultimate betrayal of that service. But Margaret had come to understand that true loyalty sometimes required protecting the institution from those who would corrupt it, even when those corrupting influences held positions of power and authority. The decision was made. In the morning, Margaret would begin the process that might save Princess Catherine, knowing that her own destruction was almost certainly guaranteed. It was a price she was finally prepared to pay for the sake of justice and truth, understanding that some choices transcended personal safety and demanded courage regardless of consequences. The palace slept around her, but Margaret remained awake through the night, preparing for the day that would change everything for both Catherine and herself. The conspiracy had been uncovered. The evidence had been gathered, and tomorrow would determine whether truth could triumph over carefully orchestrated deception in the ancient halls of power.